Hello there. I am Nathan Baird from the Indy Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
This is another edition of Boilers Extra. This is our midweek edition. We're going to keep coming to you every week, wherever you can find podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, on our websites, indystar.com, jconline.com. You'll see the video for this. We encourage people to keep coming back, subscribe, like, do all those things. It really helps us get the word out that we are back with a force with Boilers Extra. We will do post-game podcasts. In fact, Sam and I recorded one after the Indiana State game last week. No one has seen it because I'm going to say user error. I'm going to say I was not prepared for uploading that because we have to put those on YouTube. That will be the place to go after games to get our reaction, will be YouTube. So we will have that solved after the Notre Dame game, but I will take the blame for that.
Well, I know that I didn't see it, but no.
You participated. You were there for it. You witnessed it. We're in an exclusive club that witnessed. It's a club of two that witnessed that post-game podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to say I'm in rare company then and for that. But yeah, we will definitely get that fixed next time. And obviously, you can imagine after a 49-0 win, it was mostly positive, and that will probably have some ups and downs over the course of the season. But kind of piggybacking off of what we did talk about that nobody saw, a lot of good things happened, and a few not so good things happened last Saturday. I think we're going to go here and kind of react based off of those stats or performances. Was what we saw real? Was what we saw maybe, based on the opponent level of competition, things of that sort. So that's kind of the topic today that, Nathan decided we should go with. And, it's probably pretty good, especially now that I know that podcast was never uploaded.
Well, I think it's good to have a few days to sort of process this. You can watch the game again, see how some things actually played out. Because sometimes you're seeing them in real time, and even if you try to quickly see a replay, you're moving on in the game to what's happening next. So I like to go back and be able to actually take a better second look at things. But yeah, I thought this would be a good week. There's a lot of overreactions that happen in week one across college football. Like overreactions to the result of a game, overreactions to the scores of game, certainly overreactions to stats. Like and Purdue is not immune to that. It happens for every team, every fan base, every group of people who are covering a team. So I thought we should pick out some of the bigger aspects of this game. And I guess it's not so much about whether we should over or underreact. I'm trying to say, are we buying in that what we saw is something that'll happen for the rest of the season, or are we pumping the brakes and saying either no, that's probably an anomaly, or no, that's still something that because it happened against Indiana State, no offense to the Fighting Sam Kings, that you have to pump the brakes on it and say we need to wait and see what happens when they play any FBS team, let alone some of the best ones in the country like they have coming up. So I want to start with one of the kind of breakout stars of the game. And I know, Sam, you were talking to Max Clare after practice on Wednesday. You're writing something that'll be at jconline.com and indystar.com, just kind of about his background. 71 yards in the opener. That is a pace over a 12-game season for 852 yards. So my true or false here, Max Clare will go for 700 plus yards this season, and which would maybe make him Purdue's leading receiver.
Yeah, especially with the balance that this team, at least showed through one game. I would buy in that he'll get to 700. One of the things that he mentioned early in camp was because he's been asked about the injury he had last year, he was on a pretty good pace. And then it just came to a screeching halt against Illinois. He said, every time I've been injured, which, probably is not a good way to preface something. It's like, hey, I've had multiple injuries throughout my career. But he said, every time I've been injured, I came back better the next time around. And clearly, at least through one game, he looks to be right there. And, he's got a nice rapport with Hudson Card. They're very good friends, if not best friends, at least in West Lafayette. So that's, probably a nice place to start if you're going to, become best friends with somebody and you're a guy who catches passes, pick the quarterback. But I'm going to buy into this because of the first game that Max Clare had to get some confidence. He talked about how on Wednesday talked about how big of a deal it was to get into the end zone for the first time in his college career, because as good as he started last year, he didn't catch a touchdown pass. And that felt like, a little bit of a weight lifted. And now it's not like, man, I really want to get in the end zone or something of that accord. He just kind of wants to go out and play football. And, it's interesting to kind of note that he's a guy who wanted to come to Purdue and play baseball and football. Came here, was doing the fall camp stuff, and then kind of realized I can't give less than 100% to two different sports and expect to excel.
Right.
I've got to go one way or the other here. And, I think he sees a better future as a football player where he, a guy that's probably going to this year, next year, start being projected as an NFL caliber tight end. If he keeps doing this, if he gets more than 700 yards this year, surely he'll be a guy that is on scouts' radars for sure. But yeah, I definitely think that he'll get to 700 yards this year. I don't know if he'll catch a bunch of touchdowns just because of how much Purdue spread the ball around. But the yardage, it seems like it'll be there.
It's really tough to do the two sport thing anymore. It's like how much spring football do you want to miss for baseball, or how much baseball do you want to miss for spring football? That's a tough question to ask guys. And for a coach, a lot of times, I've heard these stories over the years where a guy in the recruiting process is like, I want to play both. And the coach is like, sure, you can play both. But everybody who participates in spring is going to be ahead of you every year when we get to the fall. And so that's usually how that gets broken down. So I would take the under on 700 yards only for this reason. And I went back and I like to do this. Like, I'll bring up a topic and just sort of throw it out there for you. And then I'll come back having actually researched the topic and make myself seem smarter. So last year, Colston Loveland from Michigan, so widely considered the best tight end in the Big Ten. And he had a nice first game as well. And as a guy who is an NFL tight end, is going to be, I think, a high NFL draft pick. Last year in 15 games, 649 yards. So did not even get the 700 yards in 15 games, like playing all the way through the national championship. The year before that, Sam Laporta, who was the best tight end in the Big Ten and is right now, for those of you who've already done your fantasy football drafts, is like what, the second or third tight end off the board in like
put me in the playoffs last year because nobody picked them, and I took them.
Yeah. The year before that, in only 12 games for Iowa, 657 yards. So the two best tight ends that the Big Ten has produced in the last 2 years didn't get the 700 yards. So I'm still going to take the under. Now, we have to remember the 71 yards he had, that doesn't include the big catch he had going up over the top in the middle of the field. They got called back for a holding penalty. So the first week, even though it was only 71, it really should have been closer to 100, right? That he had, if not for that penalty. So if you tweak this slightly, if you tweaked it to say Max Clare will lead Purdue in targets, I think I might buy that. And it's for two things. Number one, what you were getting into as far as the connection he and Hudson Card seem to have, like that, seemed very real. Of the things that you saw that day, sometimes you just get a vibe on things, whether it's an anomaly or whether it's something that is going to be repeatable. I think that's very repeatable. It seems like he trusts Max Clare, and that Max Clare is talented enough that you can get the right matchups. Now, again, there's going to be some games where Max Clare is not matched up against an FCS linebacker throughout the game. He's going to be lined up against a Big Ten strong safety. That's going to be a very different matchup for him. And Purdue will probably attack that matchup differently. So maybe it doesn't give me targets that game. But as far as like which guy on this team emerges with the most targets, I'm inclined to think it might be Max Clare after this first game, because of that connection, and then also because, and they're not going to rotate this deep with receivers every game, obviously. They were going deeper faster against Indiana State than they will against Notre Dame, I'm pretty sure. But they have so many other weapons in the passing game and can spread it out that way. Even though they went to Jamal Edrin very intentionally, it seemed like the first two passes of the game, and I believe even on the first snap of the second half even might have been a pass to Edrin. It seemed like very intentional that they were going at him and like featuring him in a way. There's between Shamar Rigby, CJ Smith when he comes back, any number of other guys, I think the receiver targets might get spread out to where Max Clare ends up being the guy at the end of the year. You look in December and he might have more targets from Hudson Card than anybody else.
Yeah, I think so for sure. kind of what you said is part of the reason why I would say he can get to 700 yards, or I guess I said will get to 700 yards, because as good as other Big Ten linebackers and safeties and things of that sort are, they're going to try to take away Jamal Edrin. They're going to try to take away Jerron Tibbs, and those are probably focal points, especially Edrin, when you get in these big time matchups, that sometimes you look for the underneath 5-yard dump off, and that's an area maybe where the tight end is sitting, and you're just trying to pick up the yards that you can. For that reason, he probably will get a lot of targets, especially if there's a lockdown corner on a key receiver. I guess 5-10 yards don't add up very quickly, but over the course of 12 games, if you average, whatever it was, 60, I don't know if my math's right, but somewhere in that neighborhood, you would get there.
Yeah, I think it's like 58 yards a game you'd have to average to get there. The other thing to remember is, so the Purdue splits, the run pass splits in this game, it was 31 rush attempts and 35 pass attempts. And I would be surprised if the distribution is that pronounced all season. I think there's going to be some games, like, again, what Indiana State was putting out there was a perfect matchup for Purdue to attack through the air the way it did. There's going to be some other teams that they go up against, and Notre Dame may be the first one. Notre Dame's got some real talent in the secondary that they go with a more run-heavy approach, or the way just the game script plays out.
Right.
So there's not always going to be the abundance of pass attempts that and also not just the abundance of pass attempts, but the environment to throw as much as they did won't always exist week to week. But I think the important thing, whatever yards he gets actually is not the important thing. I think the important thing is him confirming what you started to see at the beginning of last season, which was, number one, just what his talent level is, and number two, the connection that he and Card have. Because the whole point of getting a second-year quarterback, and there's a long history now of second-year transfer quarterbacks being the year that it hits, whether you're talking about what Michael Penix did last year with Washington, whether you're talking about what Joe Burrow did at LSU, and I'm not saying that Hudson Card's going to have a season like that, but there is, like, just year after year after year, some of the biggest transfer quarterback blowouts were these, like, second-year guys, breakthroughs, I should say, were these second-year guys. So part of that is the rapport that he's building with the guys in his receiving core, and looks like he was able to do that with Edrin, even though Edrin missed so much time. But it's the connection with Claire, and then what Claire can do with it that adds another dimension to this offense, maybe.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. This is kind of not to your point, but one of the things I found very interesting in Max Claire is he played quarterback up until part of his junior year of high school, and that gives him a completely different understanding of being a tight end, because he knows what a quarterback is going through in progressions. And obviously with his body frame, he was like, if I want to go to a major college and play football, I'm better suited not being a quarterback at this size. But I think that kind of just gives him a different dynamic than maybe some tight ends. And there's a lot of tight ends that transition from a different position, whether it's, a linebacker or whatever it is. I know George Karlaftis was recruited by Ohio State, and they wanted him to be possibly a tight end there. So, these super athletes that, tight ends become such a premier position in football, especially at the college and pro level, that you put a really good athlete at these positions who can do multiple things for you.
So let's stay on offense. Let's talk about Hudson Card, who, like I just said, a lot's expected of you as a second-year guy. A lot was expected of him last year, frankly, that he was a guy who had shown some things at Texas, could come in and maybe was more talented than your average Big Ten quarterback, which is in some ways not saying much when you look around the Big Ten year to year, but that's changing. And I think he has felt some responsibility to kind of live up to that this year. That last year wasn't everything he could do for any number of reasons, whether that was the offensive line health, whether that was his health, whether that was the talent in the receiver core. So what would he do with it this year? And he did about everything you could do with it in the first game. So when you complete 96% of your passes, when you throw 4 touchdowns without an interception, when you only need 25 attempts to throw for 273 yards, then you should have a really strong quarterback rating, and he did 240.53, and that was the best of any quarterback in the Big Ten, better than what Drew Aller did, against West Virginia, which was also very strong, better than what Luke Altmaier did for Illinois against Eastern Illinois. So a similar environment, right? Against an FCS, FCS opponent. The numbers there are pretty stark in terms of completion percentage, yards per attempt. Like Hudson Card was like another level above that. So
yeah, you go out.
Come out of this game, will Hudson Card lead the Big Ten in quarterback efficiency rating?
So this is a conversation I was actually having walking out of practice on Wednesday with another reporter, and it's not that none of us think that Hudson Card's good. It's just how good is Hudson Card? Like, we've seen phenomenal flashes, and we've seen, some games that you're just kind of like, there's a lot of room for growth. I don't think, especially with the teams now in this league, he's going to lead the conference in efficiency. But I also, I got emails and people on social media who respond to everything. Most of them only respond negatively. And it was against Indiana State. He did this against Indiana State. And my response is, go outside and just throw passes to your friend in the backyard and try to connect on 24 out of 25. I don't care if you're playing a high school team. That is extremely difficult to do. So this was a very good sign. But I don't think that you can expect, clearly the efficiency rating is going to go down, but I don't think you can expect it to, especially against this schedule, be a constant where, he's doing special things every single week. There's going to be weeks where he gets, knocked back down to earth a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that schedule is a big part of this conversation. And listen, there's cautionary tales out there, right? In 2020, a quarterback started his starting career. I believe it was his first start. 20 of 21 for 248 yards, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions not against an FCS. That was against a Big Ten opponent. Do you remember who that was?
In 2020. I'm going to say, was it Michael Penix for Indiana?
It was not. And I will say this, it is not a quarterback who is currently in the NFL. It's a quarterback who is still playing college football.
Oh, wow. I do not know.
It's been a while. I'll tell you. It was Wisconsin quarterback Graham Mertz did that against Illinois to start that year. And everyone thought, oh, my God, like, look at this. Wisconsin has finally solved its quarterback problem. And now Graham Mertz has a concussion and after week 1 at Florida. And who knows if he'll get back on the field because they've got a 5-star that they can throw on the field after that. And that season could go in the young guy's way pretty quickly, I think. So I'm just throwing that out there to remind people that, one game maybe doesn't tell us a lot. So I would definitely say pump the brakes on Hudson Card leading the Big Ten in quarterback rating, especially because they are going to play the defenses they're going to play. Like, say what you will about Notre Dame and its ability to score a lot of points. Marcus Freeman knows how to run a defense, and Notre Dame has strong defensive players.
But the defense was what won that game against Texas A&M.
Exactly. The Ohio State, on paper, has the best collection of defensive players. Like, I don't know when I guess Georgia a few years ago. It's that caliber though, like that caliber of defense. Just player to player to player. It's just NFL guys all over the place. Oregon, always like strong and athletic and everything on defense. Penn State, again, I don't know what they're going to be offensively as far as consistency and explosiveness, but defensively they're strong. So just those games alone, it's going to be tough to kind of keep your head above water if you're chasing a stat like quarterback rating. However, there was a stat that kind of jumped out at me from this game. So last year, and I talk a lot about like the ratings and stuff because I think those are just so much more instructive, the metrics than the actual total of like yardage or whatever. And last year, Hudson Card averaged 6.4 air yards per attempt, which just is for people who don't know, it's just the measure of the ball leaves your hand at the line of scrimmage. It meets an intended receiver somewhere downfield. What were those yards in the air? And it's, it helps separate which quarterbacks are throwing the ball downfield from which ones are throwing a lot of bubble screens and short hits and things like that. Last year, it was 6.4, which was kind of correlated with what he averaged per attempt. I think he was 6.5 yards per attempt. It was 14.1 air yards per attempt against Indiana State. And that, again, that includes, by the way, the one that wasn't complete to Edrin over the top that was but it was there, right? Anybody who saw the game would not necessarily put that as a big negative on and something that just like inflates his stats unnecessarily. And I think for two things it told me. Number one, that I think Hudson Card will have the opportunity to show that he is better than he was last year. But I also think this reflects the talent at receiver, because one guy that also jumped out at me, like a correlation that I would make here, if people remember Tanner Morgan from Minnesota, who is not like, it's not like he went on and went and did great things in the NFL. He was just kind of a pretty good Big Ten quarterback, right? In 2019, 11.1 air yards per attempt. That was when he had Tyler Johnson and Rashad Bateman. He threw for a ton of yards. He actually led the Big Ten in yards per attempt that year. So over Justin Fields, over everybody else. The next 3 years, he went 7.0, 7.4, 8.4. Now, does that mean he got worse after 2019? Or does it mean he just didn't have Tyler Johnson and Rashad Bateman to throw to anymore? And I think it's probably more the latter than the former. I think what you saw in some of these numbers from Hudson Card in week one is not just an indication that, you know, he has that poise, he knows the offense, and he was taking advantage of an undermanned opponent. I think it was also a reflection of how much Purdue is going to trust him to attack more vertically with this receiver core.
Yeah, something I thought that was telling on Monday, Tuesday, when we met with Ryan Walters, is somebody asked about the receiving core and just being a better group than last year. And he said, we had one guy with some speed last year. And I assume he's talking about Deion Burks, who was the big burner last year. And that's, kind of a slam on, it was a receiving core that he mostly inherited last year. And most of those guys are gone. So clearly it was a point of emphasis to go out and get guys who are faster and can beat receivers with speed versus just being great route runners or, in some cases just being guys. Because by the end of the season, there were some people play. I think Jaden Dixon-Veal is a pretty good receiver, and he didn't play a whole lot against Indiana State. He came in late, and, he's a guy who had, I think, 3 touchdown catches last year. So he's a capable receiver who a year ago, if you have the same receiving core, he's a valued piece of this. And right now he's a guy, and he was injured in fall camp a little bit. And I know you talked to him earlier this week. I don't know, it
wasn't really about the week one. It was for something else I'm writing, but I think he is a good example of what you're talking about, of how deep this group is.
Yeah, that, and kind of just, Shamar Rigby is probably somebody who wasn't expected to be here. And when he elevates himself up the depth chart, somebody else has to fall down. But that's a good thing for your football program when these guys are, competing for spots with each other versus last year where it's like we have to put, 2 or 3 receivers out there for our offense, but we don't truly trust our quarterback to do certain things with those guys on the field. So that is, a major reason why Hudson Card probably statistically, if he's healthy, will have a much better season than he did a year ago. Is just the weapons that are around him now.
By the way, those numbers, like when I spit numbers out like that, the yards per attempt, air yards per attempt, those are pretty easy to find. Yards per attempt is very easy to find. Keep an eye on that with Hudson Card, because he was 6.5 last year. That number's got to jump. It doesn't have to jump to a crazy level. I was looking back for another piece I'm writing for down the line. Cal Orton, I think, as a sophomore, junior, was like 7.0, 7.1, and then went up to 7.9 as a senior, which is not like astonishing. But if he was getting in that range, if you get up, and especially in the modern game of football, if you get up to like 8 yards per attempt, if Hudson Card can this year, I think that is a number that's going to reflect tremendously on what this offense is doing. But even the air yards per attempt, you can find. I found it on collegereference.com. I think there's probably other places to find it. Keep an eye on that number, because especially when you get players like they did all this without CJ Smith, who is someone that they think is going to be a real either vertical threat or someone who can take these intermediate passes out of the slot and do big things with them. I think there were really strong signs about how healthy the offense could be overall, especially when you talk about what it turns into by November. Is it going to be good enough to beat Notre Dame's defense? I don't know.
Yeah, part of that probably goes to what Purdue had on the offensive line for because the guys who were playing line at the end of the year was probably run blocking, and we see that when you look at what the running backs did last year later on in the Big Ten season, there were times where Hudson Card was under fire and he had to just, scramble out and throw the ball out of bounds. And when you do that, you're not launching it downfield a lot of times. You're throwing it 3 yards towards the sideline and just making sure it gets beyond the line of scrimmage. But that, doesn't completely demoralize your average. Usually those averages are pretty telling of, how deep in the defense are trying to pick up or throwing the ball to the I was looking kind of go with, this is maybe positive, maybe negative. I don't know. I guess more positive, but kind of a weird stat. 7 guys scored touchdowns, and it was all of their first touchdowns as Purdue Boilermakers last week, which was crazy.
That's really crazy.
Yeah,
that's a very unique thing.
My I don't know if it's an overreaction, underreaction, but I was kind of looking like, well, how far will this streak go? Will Purdue get to 10 different players scoring a touchdown before anybody gets their second? Because you got to think, Hudson Card doesn't have a touchdown. He had several rushing touchdowns last year. Devin Maccabee did not score a touchdown last week. Jamal Edrin did not score a touchdown last week. These are guys who are going to score, you would think, several over the course of the season. So you're sitting at 7 now with 3 of your primary players having not been in the end zone.
So Edrin doesn't have one yet. Rigby obviously doesn't have one yet. He hasn't. This is his first game. And did George Burren catch one last year?
He caught one two against Indiana, I believe.
Okay, that's right. So he wouldn't be in that mix.
Drew Bibber also caught one against IU.
Okay, so that makes it. I would say I'm less likely to. If I would say this, if I thought C.J. Smith was going to play against Notre Dame, the odds go up, right? Because that's one truly talented guy that you're putting on the field.
I'm not saying that they get their first
Purdue touchdown.
Their first Purdue touchdown. I'm just saying 10 different players in general. Like Maccabee has
10 different players.
And,
I think there's a chance. Yeah, I think there's a chance.
Yeah, if it's just guys getting their first touchdown as Boilermakers, I don't know if I
But I think that's even within reach. Like, that would be a fair question to ask. Like, could it get that deep on guys who have not scored before, who get their first touchdown this early in the season? And again, I think that's indicative of a confirmation of what they were telling us and what we were even seeing to some extent in terms of the depth of talent on this offense through preseason camp.
Yeah. I really thought it was interesting just that Maccabee did not score a touchdown and 3 Purdue running backs found the end zone against Indiana State. Now, that's not because Maccabee had a bad game. He had like 90 yards on 11 carries.
No, he was good. Yeah.
It was just kind of the semantics of, where Purdue was on the field and who was in the game at that time. And, Elijah Jackson just housed one that the Indiana State's defense completely whiffed on without having anybody fill a hole that I assume when you're playing a better opponent, a linebacker is going to come up and fill that gap. So you can't cut back and from the field. But I just thought that was very unique. Right now, Purdue leading scorer. So, but that's another guy first in the game. So it's 8 first points of Purdue makes.
So I'm going to go back to defense for one, and looking inside the numbers, 11 tackles for loss. I was tied for the most among any Big Ten team from week 1. 3 sacks, but the 3 sacks came on 13 attempts. And this is a number that I went and looked up. So that's 10 pass attempts, the 3 plus the 3 sacks means that's a 23.1% sack rate. That's better. It's a better sack rate than what Michigan State had when it got 7 sacks in its first game this season, because that came on 25 pass attempts. Slightly better. I think that was around 22%. And last year, Purdue's sack rate for the season, when it was 3rd in the Big Ten in sacks, was 8.6%. Obviously, they lose Nick Scarton. They move KJ Jenkins back. Other things change. So the overreaction would be, this pass rush is not just good, it's better than last year's pass rush. Would you buy or sell that?
Man, it's hard because one of those guys is probably going to be drafted in the first round of the next NFL draft. And he was heavily in that Notre Dame versus tonight. So I think it has a possibility to be because of depth, more so than last year. It was really two edge rushers, and occasionally you would get somebody else getting in the backfield to get some pressure on there, a Yanni Karloftis or Jeffrey Mba, whoever it might be. Malik Langham last year, I think, got a couple of sacks, but I'm gonna sell it just because of you had the number 1 and number 3 leaders in sacks in the Big Ten last season, and a lot of times you were playing from behind, so those teams weren't needing to pass late in games and things of that sort. So and then the season ultimately ended because Nick Scorton got in the backfield and sacked Indiana's quarterback to seal a game. So I think just because of the volume of what those two outside linebackers or rush ends or whatever Purdue wants to call them, they're essentially defensive ends, but they have linebacker capabilities as well. I think last year is probably going to go down as better, and especially when you look at over time the two players that were featured in that defense last year. But if it gets close, it's going to be because of depth. It's going to be because probably 2 or 3 other guys are splitting up the sacks that aren't Will Helt's. Will Helt might surpass both of those guys' sack totals last year by himself, but do the other guys make up for the rest?
So if I was already holding that stock, which I guess I did bold predictions, and one of the bold predictions I posted was Purdue will lead the Big Ten in sacks, I think is what it was. And if I'm holding this stock that the pass rush will be better than it was last year, I guess it's not a matter of buying or selling. If I'm holding the stock already, I'm keeping it through the Notre Dame game. I want to see what happens against Notre Dame because I'm actually inclined to think that this might be true. And it's not that the people in the pass rush are better than they were last year. I think that might be demonstrably not true because I think Nick Scarton is a tremendous player, and you guys all saw that last season. But I think it's the collective, what the pass rush becomes in this collective defense that has improved. I was really impressed. Like KJ Jenkins getting a sack the way he did, running down, and I know it's Indiana State, but like he ran 2/3 of the field to take a guy down take the quarterback down for a loss for his sack. I thought it was like the most Mike linebacker way to get a sack, and that was like such a positive development out of that game for Purdue. Will Helt didn't just have a productive game; like he was one of the few guys that you would look at on the field and say, "Oh, maybe that's an unfair matchup." Like that's what you look like when you're taking a Big Ten team against an FCS team. How unfair does it look? It didn't look, I don't think, unfair across the board, but there were some matchups that looked kind of unfair, and his was one of them. Sheeta Silla getting his first sack. CJ Madden didn't get to the quarterback, but he did get a hurry. Like you're getting a bunch of guys. So all those guys are active and getting the wins that you want them to get against an undermanned opponent. But I still think the most crucial thing for Purdue's pass rush this year, especially because you lost a talent like Scourton, is the secondary has to be better, has to make things tougher on opposing quarterbacks. And I think there's still reason to believe that that is very true. And especially when you think about the fact that Nyland Green, who might be pound for pound the most talented guy they have back there, he would challenge Thieneman for that, I think. Not there's a lot of other things that Dylan Thieneman does that enhance his skills. So he's, I think, probably still your number 1 guy back there. But Nyland Green is a really talented guy, and we've talked throughout camp about kind of the attitude he brings and the how his playing style helps his secondary. When he comes back healthy, it gives you another weapon to kind of neutralize those opposing whoever your opponent's best receiver is. So I'm still inclined to think this could end up being true, but not because any individual player is looking like he's the next Nick Scourton. It's more that the entire defense is more talented, deeper, better, or I should say more familiar, more facile in this defense in the second year of the system, and just is a more cohesive unit than it was throughout much of last year. Again, when you start talking about numbers, I guess I'm not even sort of measuring. That's why I didn't make it. This is a little bit more nebulous. It's not they'll have a better sack percentage or they'll have more sacks. It's like, will the pass rush be better? Because that's more of a judgment call, I suppose, because it could be better and the numbers don't end up being better because of some of the opponents they have to play.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. One of the sacks that Will Helt had, he just didn't do anything special. He just took off on a sprint, ran right between the guard and tackle, and both of them turned and looked at each other like, "Oh, I guess our quarterback is." We left him out to dry, and he got smoked on that play. But kind of, you mentioned judgment calls, and I'm going to go with my next, I guess, topic or overreaction, underreaction debate here, and it's not a positive one as these other ones have seemed to be. I said Purdue will lead the Big Ten in penalties this season. Underreact, overreact. Last year, Purdue averaged, I think, 6 penalties a game, which was the third most in the Big Ten. There are more teams in the league now, but Purdue was penalized 11 times, second only to Michigan State out of the Big Ten teams in the first game. And it's not like these officials were flag happy. Indiana State had 2 penalties the whole game, for example. 11 penalties for 100 plus yards against Indiana State probably doesn't look promising. A couple of those were personal fouls, which add up pretty quickly. But what do you think? Was that a reason to overreact, underreact? That Purdue, 11 penalties is alarming, and if you have 11 penalties against Notre Dame, you're not going to be in that ball game.
Oh no! If they have 11 penalties against Notre Dame, it's going to be quite ugly. Unless it is like what you're talking about, where for whatever reason the officials are obsessed with yellow that day and are throwing them all over the place. There's only 7 teams. That's not just where they ranked in the Big Ten. 7 teams in the country in their opening game had more penalties or more penalty yards than Purdue did. That is a concern, and it's one of the first things that I think Ryan Walters said when he came in post game that's not indicative of what he thinks his team is. And you see teams have these spikes once in a while. I'm inclined to say they will not lead the Big Ten in penalties. And I think if they do lead the Big Ten in penalties, then we will get to Thanksgiving weekend and say this team's not going to bowl because it led the Big Ten in penalties. That could be the determining factor, because there's going to be too many games and I'm thinking right now, like Nebraska looked pretty strong in its first game. We don't still know exactly what Oregon State's about because of all of the turnover that it's had. Michigan State looked like it can move the ball potentially and take some shots downfield in its game. Indiana looked pretty solid in its opener. Like, take away those ranked opponents, you're still left with whatever that is, 7 more games, and none of them are games that you think Purdue absolutely can win no matter what. They're all games that are probably going to be in the balance. And if you start having games like this, if they repeat this in any of those games, it's probably the reason they lose that game, or reason why they never even had a chance to win it.
Yeah, and the reason I said judgment calls is because, especially with the Sheeta Salah got to the quarterback, and it looked like it was a bang bang play that.
Yeah.
In the circumstance, Indiana State's getting crushed, and the flag comes out, but I don't know if a penalty was merited there. But I also can see why you would throw the flag on that situation.
Yeah, I almost thought that was like are they doing that week 1 to kind of prove a point? You do it week 1 in a game that's out of hand, so you don't have to throw that flag later because it's not a bang bang call the next time. But it's just one of those unfortunate things about the game right now that but you're right. That's one that I would say is not indicative of like a problem.
Right. Yeah. And last year, and even 2 years ago, when Purdue was pretty good and was in the Big Ten championship game, a lot of the penalties were just stupid, like reactions, frustrations, saying things after a play was over, whatever it might be, or hitting a guy who's 2 yards out of bounds. We didn't see those kinds of penalties. You can live with the holding because that's technique and you can work on that. You can even probably live with a late hit on the quarterback because now you have a teaching moment. Like, hey, if it's close, don't take him to the ground. Wrap him up, let go of him when he lets go of the ball. So I also will, I don't think Purdue's going to lead the Big Ten in penalties. I think it may actually be a good thing for Purdue in a way that you won't get penalized 11 times in a game you win 49-0. To have that on film and say, here's where we've got to get better so we're not penalized down the road for these same, falls, I guess, or, holding. There's probably holding on every play, to be honest, but what the officials are looking for if your hands are outside the pads and things of that sort. I think there's just a lot of things that come out of this game you can benefit from by saying we won this game 49-0, but we weren't perfect.
Right. And I think more to the point, they were up 21-0 at halftime. It should have been more than that.
Right.
And there were penalties that took points off the field, basically. Not anything that negated a touchdown, but I'm thinking of the one drive where 2 holding penalties take away 2 more complete. Hudson Card should have been 26 of 27 in this game. And 24 of 25 was what he was. He should have been 26 of 27. And I don't think that the holds that happened on those 2 plays were instrumental in why the play ended up happening. I'd have to go back and take a closer look, I guess. But those seem to be the ones that have to get cleaned up. And we should also say they were rotating a lot of guys in, and guys who probably didn't get as many number 1 reps as other guys did, as your starters usually did, especially on the offensive line. Like, they were rolling some guys in there to try to get as many reps as they could at some places. And you have guys who are not necessarily playing out of position, but maybe not playing their best position. And that contributed, I think, to a couple of those. So there's guys who were in the game that wouldn't usually be in the game to commit that penalty. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. So, against Notre Dame, against Nebraska, against Indiana. So that's the other thing that I kind of came out of that game with. Like, some of those penalties were specific to those circumstances that I think they told those players something that will make them better in the long run, more than they told Purdue that it has a problem across the board that it needs to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by the 4th quarter, there were a lot of names that we're not going to see in a lot of games, but you have to get those guys into those games because, as Purdue saw last year, injuries happen. There's going to be scenarios where you need a guy to come into a game, and you can't have it being the first time they've played major college football. So yeah, that probably did atone for some of it. I think on that drive you were mentioning I think there were completions to Jamal Edrin and Max Clare on that drive that were wiped away. There was also, I think, a false start. And that's not technique. That's just, you have to be smarter and know the snap count in those situations. And those are things that I also think you can clean up, but there's also things that are going to happen, especially when you get into road environments and it's hard to hear at Ohio Stadium or wherever you might be. But you can't have these stupid personal fouls that really cripple your, getting off the field on a 3rd down, but then the chains move because of a personal foul, for example.
It's just killer too. Like, you're at Wisconsin, you're neck and neck. You come out, you get a first down right after Wisconsin scored. Maybe they just had to kick off to you. You come out, you get a first down. It's 1st and 10 at the 35, your own 35, and then you false start, and now it's 1st and 15, and you get 14 yards out of the next 3 plays, which is good, but you're still punting, right? And now you've missed a chance to flip the game. You missed a chance. Maybe you're giving them back. Like, it's just those little things. Like, in some of these games, the margin is going to be very, 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 very small, and they have to clean those things up. Anything else that you wanted to address over underreaction out of that opener?
I don't know how to phrase this as far as overreaction, underreaction, but I guess I'll just phrase it like this. Purdue will be much more efficient in the red zone as a whole this season. 5 of 5 with 5 touchdowns. Did get a 4th and 1 or 4th and 2 conversion on one of those drives where, if you're playing a close game, you probably kick a field goal there. I think because of the opponents and, the opportunity to get somebody else a touchdown, Purdue went for it. And you also have to go for it on 4th down just to kind of find out what plays work in those circumstances too. But 5 of 5, and last year Purdue was around 72% in the red zone, which is not great. I mean, you want to score closer to 90% of your red zone opportunities because you think at the very least you should be able to kick a field goal. And Purdue was not very efficient kicking field goals last season for numerous reasons. But I guess, will Purdue be better or more efficient offensively in the red zone this season?
I would definitely buy this. And I think even if you're including the modifier much, which is, again, somewhat measurable, I would still say yes. I mean, that score percentage that you mentioned was 72.09% in the red zone last year. This is how bad that was. Iowa, which had an offense that was not just like underwhelming, but was like nationally mocked on a week-to-week basis, partially because of the ridiculous nepotism that was going on there, but an offense that people thought was essentially inept to its core, 80% score rate in the red zone. So that tells you a little bit of what Purdue was dealing with last year. And part of that is factored into, that's just scoring at all, which means that, as you're saying, like the field goals are factored into that. And that was a kind of a separate problem. The touchdown percentage was actually better than a little bit than what you would expect from what the score percentage was, but still not good. So I think it is going to be better for, I think, 3 reasons. One, we've already mentioned, is Max Clare. I think having a tight end that you can really rely on, those are huge weapons in the red zone. What you can do formationally, you can put multiple tight ends on the field, and not just not much how much they believe in Max Clare, but I think they in Burhan and Bibbert, like they've got multiple tight ends that they believe in, and I think that Graham Harrell's got some things he can play with there formationally and trying to get some interesting matchups when defenses come out and something that they feel like they can exploit. He's number one. Number two is the increased height just across the receiving core. And that was something else Ryan Walters mentioned on Monday. In addition to talking about the speed, he was also talking about how much size it feels like they've added to that group of receivers. And then the third thing is the one that I come out still not 100% sure how I feel about it, but it's the field goal situation. I asked after the game because I thought it was worth just clarifying this. Spencer Porath kicked all the PATs. Ben Freehill did all of the kickoffs, but we didn't actually see them attempt a field goal. And I thought it was worth asking, like, how would you have done that if a field goal had come up, or maybe especially if multiple field goal opportunities had come up? How would that have been handled? Would you have switched them off? Was that competition still going? And he said, no, those are Porath. Porath is going to kick the field goals, at least to start the year. So that gave us a piece of information about where things stand. But until we actually see him go out there and do it, and it's kind of unfortunate that they didn't get that opportunity. It's one of the things that maybe a drive like those holding penalties cost you, even if it doesn't result in a touchdown. Maybe that was your chance to get him on the field, real game, real opponent, real pass, real rush, and kicking in those conditions, because that may seem like a small thing, but we see them do it every day in practice. It's just so different kicking towards the parking lot at Bimmel than it is kicking in a real stadium with guys coming at you. And he's a true freshman. So I think that would have been the one thing that, if you were scripting the day for Purdue that didn't come to fruition, that really could have helped them. I think that was it. Because now it could be, we got a chance to tie the game going into halftime against Notre Dame. Go out there and hit it from 45 yards or whatever, and you haven't attempted one yet in a real game. So we'll see what he's made of when that comes around. But that could also be, even if it's more stable this year, it's 2 freshmen, there could still be some growing pains.
Yeah, I'm going to go with, however I phrase it, I don't even remember now, but I think Purdue will be better in the red zone in terms of scoring this year as well. And for, several of the reasons you just mentioned, but also just because Purdue was bad. Like, there were times where Purdue would go for it on 4th down and 3, for example, rather than try to kick a field goal, because you had more faith in getting 3 yards than you did in kicking a, not a super long field goal. If you're in the red zone, you're kicking from 40 and in. So it just seemed like Purdue didn't have maybe the personnel to convert in some of those situations last year at times. And Purdue had some, bad turnovers, at least early in the year too, fumbling issues and things of that sort, which there was a fumble last Saturday, but it probably halted a touchdown drive or a scoring drive, but it didn't hurt in the grand scheme of things. I thought it was probably good that there weren't more fumbles. I think that was the only fumble Purdue had. It wasn't like Purdue fumbled and recovered its own fumble at any point. So I think that Purdue's going to be better taking care of the ball, first of all. And also, like you said, there's just better personnel on the field with this offense and special teams units when you have those scoring opportunities.
Yeah, Purdue was actually only 7th in the Big Ten in getting red zone opportunities. So like middle of the pack Big Ten, like they had 43 red zone attempts in only 12 games. A lot of teams played 13 games or more, and some of them had fewer red zone attempts over the course of the year than Purdue did. But when you're getting in there at a 7th place rate and you're converting them at a 13th place rate, it's just killer. And when you look back on a season and say, man, that felt soft. That felt like that 4-8 felt soft. Like that felt like it should have been better and there were missed opportunities. That's a stat that like directly correlates to that. And if you could take like 4 touchdowns, if I gave you 4 touchdowns and fired up the flex capacitor and sent you back in time to last Purdue season to scatter them around, Like you could take 4 touchdowns, 4 missed red zone opportunities, or even if just 4 red zone scores, 2 touchdowns, 2 field goals, you could probably manipulate those somehow. I have to go back and look at the scores again, but if not, get you 2 more wins, get you a lot closer to where you had a chance late in games that you otherwise wouldn't have. Like 4 of those possessions can make a huge difference in a season, and it's an area that they have to shore up this year. It's the only chance I think they have to be better than last year's record is to be better than that in the red zone. If they're down in the 70s again in total score percentage in red zone, then not only 4-8 might look good, frankly.
Well, I'm going to get on eBay and try to find one of these flux capacitors. I don't know if anybody has one for sale, but
you have to
I'm
make
sure
your
Purdue,
own. Doc Brown.
Yeah.
They
Purdue
made a whole
would definitely
documentary
invest in
about it.
that.
Back to the
Well,
Future.
Purdue's
You
got
can watch it.
engineers all over the place, so they should
That's
be able
true.
to. If anybody, can you try to build us one of these so we can go back and be in a bowl game last year?
I'm going to go ahead and say this. We haven't run this by our bosses. If you build a time machine, you can come be a guest on Boilers Extra. Build a time machine. Give us some sort of proof that it works. I'm not going in there first. You find someone who will, college students are always like signing up, right, for those experiments. Give them $50, send them back a week, bring them back. And if you can prove it, you can come on Boilers Extra.
Yeah, and I'm in West Lafayette. You're, a little bit further away, so they can come to my house if they wanted to do it, or we can just jump on here and add you to the call, however you want to do it. And we'll get you on here for sure.
Absolutely. I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. We're not going to get too heavy into, obviously we didn't get at all heavy into Notre Dame stuff. This is Purdue's one of the 2 bye weeks that this year's schedule gives them. I don't like saying bye. It's more like just an off week, an idle week.
I was told that don't call it a bye week. It's an idle week or an off week.
Yeah. So we'll try to keep consistent with that throughout the year. So no post-game pod this weekend because obviously no game this weekend. There won't be a post-game to pod about. I will be actually at the Illinois-Kansas game just as a spectator. Some friends are coming in. That's how I'm using my weekend off. But then next week, it's an intriguing game for me. And I don't know if it will be around college football because there isn't a respect right now nationally for Purdue, but it seems like a game where they can get some of that respect even without winning. It seems like, and I know that that's the last thing anybody over at that football facility wants to hear. Only reporters and fans think about the game that way. The people who are playing the game, no moral victories. But I think they can get some of that respect if this is a game in the fourth quarter where Purdue has the ball with a chance to either threaten or make things really tough on Notre Dame. That's the baseline goal I think you have going into this game. And I think if you come out of this game having done that, then you have accelerated. Probably you're gonna open some eyes. But Notre Dame just went on the road and really handled Texas A&M, and they have like what people think right now is just a very clear runway to a 12-0 regular season. That was like the one stumbling block people saw for them. They think they can coast from here on in to 12-0. And I think that Purdue is probably, if I'm a coach there, I'm finding every piece of that and taping it up around the locker rooms.
Yeah, the good thing, and Ryan Walters said that he watched some of that game. You have, Notre Dame has a game this weekend. Notre Dame will win handily. But you saw some flaws in Notre Dame's offense, I think, and part of that is because Texas A&M is really good defensively, but you saw some things that frustrated Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame is going to work on those flaws and presumably get better before next week, but I definitely think we'll definitely get into that more down the road, especially after having seen Notre Dame play a game that it should be able to score at will almost. But there are some, things, some reasons for optimism if you're a Purdue fan going into next week.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking ahead to next week. It's like where does this game lie? If the Purdue defense really has taken a step forward, it's the chance. It's what keeps them in games like this. Because I just don't think this offense, as much as we've been complimentary of this offense, I don't know if I'm ready to say this is like a 35-point offense against the other best teams on this schedule, right? If you're going to win this game, you've probably got to keep it in the 20s. But we've seen Notre Dame in the last couple of years. I'm thinking back to 2022. They opened the season against Ohio State, gave Ohio State like a really tough game. That's an Ohio State team that then went on and lost by 1 to Georgia in the Peach Bowl. And if they had made a field goal at the end of the game, they're probably a national champion in 2022. But again, just can't score enough. And then the next week they go out and lose to, who was it? It was somebody just, was it like East Carolina or somebody? It was somebody just like bizarre that they lost to 1 week later. And people were like, what is even going on with this team? But that was early on in the Marcus Freeman tenure, obviously former Purdue assistant. And it's going to be interesting to see what Notre Dame is really about. Like, I think they got to see more of what they really are against going on the road to play a team like Texas A&M. But in week 1, you're still judging everything based on the assumptions you had going in somewhat. So we'll know a little bit more about them than we'll know about Purdue, possibly even by next week. So I'm looking forward to that game. Thanks for coming here to Boilers Extra. We'll talk a whole lot more about that middle of next week, and we will get the post-game pods to you guys on YouTube. But find this one everywhere you can find podcasts, and follow us on Twitter. I'm at NW Baird. He's at Samuel T. King. Sam, anything you want to say to sign off?
No, just thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. And like Nathan said, and you hear this on any YouTube video or podcast you listen to, hitting like and subscribe. Those things they definitely boost us, but also it helps us get our name out there and hopefully get some more followers, and it gives us a reason to kind of delve deeper into some of this stuff.
And also, let us hear from you. Like, send us messages on Twitter, hit us on our email or whatever. Like, we want to hear from you, maybe especially for those post-game pods. I would love to hear after the Notre Dame game next week. What are your thoughts? Like, what are you feeling about that? What are you thinking about what you just saw? What do you think it means for the rest of the season? Because we're doing this for all of you who are listening, and we think you're going to be an important part of this. So for Sam, I'm Nathan. We'll see you next week.